This is Sarah, and today I'm going to talk about thighs. My thighs, particularly the meat located underneath the butt leading into the butt. So this is the two spots on my pulse pack board that are routing to the actual left and right thigh. And for the thighs, I'm developing an augment which I am lovingly referring to as the hotspot. The hotspot. It's the separating gap peripheral. I don't know. So I first had to figure out what sensor I was going to use to get data from this part of my body, and it made sense to, of course, use a temperature sensor. In discussing things, mechanical things that could potentially affect the body, something that's come up quite a bit in our discussions in the kiddie pool is this butt squeezing and separating technique that my friend has. I knew from the very beginning when I first started this project that I was going to make something that replicated this particular, it's like a grabbing and pulling apart motion. In order to do this, I realized I was going to have to attach something to the thighs. It would need to begin with an anchor that attached to my skin in some way. The anchor would then connect to a sort of tendon that would wrap around the contours of the thighs from the inside out, kind of like in longitudinal lines, and then terminate at a motor that was doing the pulling. So, I'm gonna tip, oh, I lost the tip. In order to pull pulleys that are embedded in these ass tendons, I knew I was going to have to use some sort of winch system, and I've never made a winch before. I don't really know a lot about winches, but it's a fun word, so I decided to make, it's effectively a winch hip belt. And when the winches pull, it separates the meat and creates this lovely little piece of gap in between my legs. It's a gap creator. So the kicker to this is once the cheeks are separated and the gap is created, there is a light that shines from the back to the front. It's like a beacon. Anyone standing directly in front of me will see that area, that gap that's created, illuminate in kind of a glowing triangle. That's the hotspot. This is supposed to happen at an amount equal to the level of heat radiating off of the inside of my thighs. You're probably immediately thinking of two things right off the top of your head. One, the winches need to be mounted very solidly to something in order to actually pull like a mass apart. So I needed to make sure that the winches weren't gonna move once they started pulling on that tendon. Otherwise my ass cheek would end up pulling on my hip. The other thing, well, how much torque do you actually need to separate butt cheeks? I had to figure this out. So I went over to my butt technician's house, which is Noodle's Shape Daddy.
We developed a system to measure force.
Yeah? What kind
Specifically pull force.
Pound force? Tony. He rigged up this test environment for my butt, and he actually used Gorilla Tape and zip ties, very long ones, to basically test the same situation that I'm going to have on my butt with the apparatus that I'm building. So I'm going to try and explain this as best I can about how to calculate raw force. So you take a string and it's attached on one end to the thing that you're pulling, and at the other end it's attached to a tension spring. And then you pull on that tension spring, and once that thing that you're ultimately trying to like displace is pulled the amount that you think is good, for me this is my butt cheeks spread so that there's sufficient gap, you then take calipers and you measure the spring again. Then you rig up the same setup, except you take weights and you keep adding weights to the end of the spring until it's stretched the same amount as it was before. And once it's achieved, you then take that amount of weight, weigh it, that's the amount of raw force it takes to do the thing. And we determined that it takes 9.5 pounds of raw force to displace my butt to an amount needed to create sufficient gap between my legs. Yeah? So now that I know this, I can order my motors, right? So I went with a motor that had 200 ounce-inches of torque. I went a little bit high because I didn't want to stall it or burn it out. The motor mounts onto a frame that hugs the specific shape of my hip bone. Similarly, I fashioned a belt out of thin pieces of sheet plastic. The belt sandwiches my pelvis in such a way that my hip bone pops out, and the motor frame can then seat directly on top of this protruding bone. The design of the belt and the motor frame combined allow for the entire apparatus to sit solidly on my body and not move around a whole lot. If my motor is at one end of this tendon, at the opposite end is the anchor. And this is the thing that actually attaches to my flesh. The anchor also needed to be a particular shape so that when it pulled on my butt, the force was equally distributed throughout my skin. I actually had a couple of my friends come over one night and help me figure out exactly what the best shape was. Of course, something had to connect the motor of the winch to the anchor. Early on, my butt technician determined that the drum of my winch couldn't be any larger than 1 inch in diameter, so I had to spec a certain type of cable for the task that was able to bend in a tight radius to fit onto my spool. However, this tendon couldn't be so thin that it was in danger of cutting into my flesh, because that's also bad. After some hunting around, I found ultra-flexible 16th inch wire rope with a vinyl coating on the outside, which would make it more skin-friendly. And it works great for the job. I 3D printed a cosmetic casing to cover my winch and complete the robot hip bone aesthetic. It's complete with some yummy looking arcade stick buttons that work as a up and down override function for the winch motor. It was also necessary to make a spacer for underneath the motor's bracket. It tweaks the position and angle of the motor in such a way that the tendon has a straight angle of approach coming off the winch's spool. How does the thread get to school? The spool bus. I'm like talking about spools, and I get this one. You wouldn't believe me if I didn't show you. I wear this thing, and once my body starts elevating in temperature, at least down between my thighs, the winches slowly start winding and pulling my cheeks to separate them. That's the point when the light turns on and creates the hot spot. If I'm excited enough for my temperature to raise, my legs will tell you this, particularly the magic triangle, the triangle of truth. So, all right, for the time being, I'm gonna get back to work. As always, keep making awesome stuff out there, and thank you for watching. Like, the best part about eating a popsicle is that you get a stick after you're done eating the sweet stuff, and you can kind of like chew on it. I don't know if anyone else out there chews on their stick.